We're going to talk a little bit about the city wanting to develop West Hayden Island. That's out there between us and Vancouver. And I have as my guest immediately on my right, Bob Sallinger with the Audubon Society. Right? I forget your title there.
Conservation Director.
Conservation Director. That's a good title for what we're trying to talk about.
Yeah.
And then we also have Timme Helzer.
Correct.
Who is with the Save West Hayden Island.
Correct.
And there's also a website. We'll put that up. It's simple, www.savewesthaydenisland.net, I believe. And we'll also get up the information about the Audubon Society. Is there information on your website?
There is, and we have a Facebook page as well.
Oh, all right, we'll get that information up. And we also have here our old trusty Richard Carpenter, who does a lot of programming here at Public Access, whether here or Tualatin Valley as well. Apparently, they're wanting to develop West Hayden Island because the east part's already developed, right?
It is. Most of East Hayden Island is totally developed, but most of West Hayden Island is completely undeveloped, and it's approximately equal halves.
Mm-hmm. And so, why do they want to develop it, and why do you object?
Well, the city is not planning to develop it. It is managed by the Port of Portland on behalf of the state of Oregon.
Oh, so it's not the city at all?
It's not the cities, but the Port of Portland is coming to the city of Portland to ask the city to annex this 825 acres into the city limits. It's now Multnomah County, but it's not part of the city. And then to rezone it from farm forest to industrial, so that the port will have an opportunity then to attract potential clients and develop it into a major industrial park.
So they don't have any clients for it already then?
They have none. In fact, we have studied this for a long time, and there doesn't seem to be any economic demand for a development of this size in this particular location. And we've studied it for years, and we've done an intense study of it the last 18 months on behalf of the city, and there just doesn't seem to be any demand for what the port is claiming they want to develop there.
What claims are they making? I think you mentioned they want to put automobile receiving.
Well, it's an interesting location in that it has deep water access on the Columbia River, 43-foot channel. It has barge traffic accessibility. It has major north-south railroad lines, and it has interstate highway access. So from a development perspective, hey, this is a great spot. What they would like to do is build an extremely large circular railway on the island that they can offload from ships imported cars and put those in a major parking lot in the center of the island, move them onto a long train, hook them onto the north-south Burlington Northern Santa Fe line, and ship imported cars around the country. So that's one piece that they'd like to develop. The other piece is a major grain terminal.
Grain?
Grain.
We do. I know a large percentage of the nation's wheat, I think, comes from Central Oregon.
Well, from particularly northeast Washington, comes down by barge from and train into this area. But Kalama, the Port of Kalama, has just built a state-of-the-art grain terminal and has sucked up most of that economic opportunity. So there's really not much demand for new grain terminals here. And if you fly over this area, you'll see that there are a number of major import parking lots for import cars, some of which are half empty. And yet Vancouver has just developed a new import car terminal. So we don't see any need for what the port is claiming they can do economically, and they're claiming jobs. There aren't any jobs in this project beyond the initial development. No family jobs to speak of. There's a great expense in constructing something like this, and the city will be on the hook for major millions of dollars to provide infrastructure. The city is required as a city to provide infrastructure to new areas that they've just annexed into the city. So we're talking about a $150 million bridge, streets, all of the utilities that'll go into supporting a major industrial park. And where's the city going to come up with a couple $100 million bucks?
Well, they must have a lot of money in their general fund left over for paying all the teachers.
Out in North Portland, aren't there adequate incoming area for automobiles, or
Bob can probably speak to that.
in North Portland?
Well, I think it's important to understand the Port's been trying to do this for a long time. They took this property in 1994 from PGE, which owned it, and they took it under their powers of condemnation. They like to talk about how they bought it for this purpose, but in fact they took it away from another organization that wanted to develop it. It was opposed, the development was opposed when PGE owned it. It was opposed when the Port took it by condemnation. And it's opposed in part because it is such a valuable parcel from a natural resource perspective, and we can talk about that a little bit, but also because there really hasn't been this need that Tim has talked about. They tried to annex it and rezone it back in 1999. In fact, that's one of the first projects I worked on for Portland Audubon Society. And they wanted to develop a 500 to 600 acre project out there back in 1999. They were going to leave 100 to 200 acres of natural area around the edges, but pretty much decimate the natural resources out there. And they ran into a lot of problems. It turned out that the economic analysis wasn't sound. It turned out that they weren't working with the Port of Vancouver. They were competing with the Port of Vancouver. And a coalition of environmental groups, neighborhood groups, and the Business Journal of Portland actually basically shut down that project in 1999. And you know, it's not terribly surprising that environmental groups and neighborhoods would necessarily oppose this, but the Business Journal of Portland was equally ardent in terms of its opposition.
Would hurt existing business, probably.
Well, their concern was that the Port claimed there were no other alternatives, that every bit of developable land on either side of the river was gone. This was the last parcel that could serve this huge need that was out there. And they claimed that they had looked at other opportunities, including the Port of Vancouver, and when the Business Journal of Portland went and checked that story out, they found out that no, in fact, the Port of Vancouver was building a facility that looked just like the one that the Port of Portland was building. And eventually, the Port of Portland was forced to concede this, that their analysis, both on the economic and the environmental side, as well as their alternatives analysis, were not sound. And in 2000, they shelved the project. They spent millions of dollars trying to annex it and rezone it back in 1999, 2000. And at the end of the day, they decided to give it up and put it into Marine Industrial Reserve. And the Business Journal of Portland was writing editorials about this, front page articles. We were opposing it. Neighborhoods were opposing it. It was just really a complete train wreck for the Port of Portland, and they did concede that they really had not looked at other opportunities. And so it sat in Marine Industrial Reserve, basically in limbo, for the better part of a decade, at which point the Port tried to do this again, and this is why we're here today. They went to the city and are trying to annex it and rezone it, because that has to happen before any sort of economic development would occur out there.
So the city is a player in this, then?
The city is a big player in this.
Yeah.
But one of the things that was done was an economic analysis, and they looked at the different kinds of marine cargo that comes through Portland and Vancouver down the Columbia Corridor. And what they found out in this really is that the only thing for which there's likely to be a deficiency in the near future between now and 2040 is automobiles. All the other different types of cargo, whether it's grain, bulk, you know, all the different various types of cargo, there is sufficient capacity through 2040. Automobiles are the one thing that they do show a potential deficiency in, but as Tim already mentioned, they are, the Port of Vancouver is building auto facilities, and when we had the opportunity to ask the Port's consultants whether there was going to be additional need beyond the Port of Vancouver facilities when those get built, their answer was it was unlikely. So really there is no compelling need to do this. The other thing that we're really interested in is better and more efficient use of the existing land base, and that can happen in two ways. First of all, when you go to Asian and European ports, you find out that because they have a very limited land base, they're doing a much better job of using what they do have efficiently, and that's building vertically, taking cars directly off of ships and directly onto trains, but much less land intensive, or much more land intensive use there.
Better use of their resources
exactly.
too, because they have less.
The Port of Portland's refused to look at those kinds of opportunities because they claim the market here doesn't support that. Because we still have open space, they prefer to develop that first and then go back later and figure out were there ways to have done it better. And it does sort of remind me of the old growth debates that we had a decade or two ago, where the logging industry argued, let's just log all the old growth and then we'll figure out how to retool the industry when we're all through with it. And of course the conservation community argued, no, let's save the last 5% and figure out how to do it right now. Similarly, the Port of Portland's arguing, let's take the last open land that we have, develop that, and then we'll figure out how to do it efficiently. The second way that they could be more efficient is to work collaboratively with the Port of Vancouver and other ports up and down the Columbia Corridor. The same argument that the Business Journal was making 10 years ago. Rather than competing with each other, look at collaboration, make sure that we're maximizing the existing industrial land base before we go and develop the last greenfields that are out there. And again, that hasn't happened. They've had 10 years to do it. They've made no forward progress as far as we can see since they shelved the project 10 years ago.
I'm under the impression that you want this land for Audubon and just non-commercial use.
We want this land protected permanently in its entirety, all 826 acres. And the reason for that is it's a unique parcel. And it's unique for really 3 reasons. The first is there's an amazing amount of wildlife that uses the Columbia Corridor and the Willamette Corridor. And that's both fish and birds and other wildlife. And that includes listed salmon species that come through here under the Endangered Species Act. Most of our landscape is developed, but this wildlife still comes through and it still needs places to stop and rest and forage. And places like West Hayden Island are incredibly rare. So the first thing that really makes it so valuable is its location at the confluence of the Willamette and Columbia rivers. Those are incredibly productive areas. Historically, they were biological hotspots. So its location makes it a very important natural resource area.
Well, Tim was telling me it's near Kelly Point.
Near Kelly Point. The second thing is its size. At over 800 acres, it's one of the largest unprotected natural areas left in the region. And there's no substitute for size when it comes to natural areas. We have a lot of small fragmented bits, but they don't serve the same functions as a large intact area. No. The third thing is that it has this complex mosaic of different habitat types. You have grasslands, cottonwood bottomland forests, wetlands, beaches, shallow water habitat for migrating salmon. And that complexity is very, very hard to find. We typically have, individual pieces, a forest chunk here and a wetland over here, but to have them all in the same parcel really increases the value. The sum is greater than the parts.
So you're saying even though they want to pave over part of this, it would pretty much take the rest of it out as well.
Right, and what the port has proposed really would take out the majority of the island and leave just edge habitat. You'd have a strip along the bottom and then the tip. But that heart of the island will be gone. And to give you a sense of how little is left really out there, West Hayden Island represents 4% of the cottonwood ash forest that's left between River Mile 12 and the Bonneville Dam. More than 100 miles of river. This is once the dominant habitat type. Most of it's gone today. And so this one parcel represents 4% of all the intact bottomland cottonwood forest that's left. It's a pretty amazing resource.
But I'm kind of wondering, I can understand, where Audubon Society is coming from, and you're organized with a group called the Friends of West Hayden Island. Well, what exactly are you doing towards this? He's taking the conservation aspect.
My background is as a business consultant. That's been my profession for 40 years. I teach management and organizational leadership at the university level. I consult around the world. I'm pro-business. But there is nothing that the port and the city and the state have been able to show us that there's a demand for any kind of viable, sustainable business operation there. On the other hand, since my coming here in 1946, I've been a long-time camper, wildlife trekker and camper. I know the value of West Hayden Island. I haven't camped there, but I've certainly walked it frequently. It's a rich diversity of wildlife. There are 81 species of birds, 9 species of mammals, 4 species of reptiles, 9 species of moths and butterflies, and then quite a wide variety of fish that use those shallows as kind of a nursery to grow up before, and a relatively protected area. So it is a rich diversity of wildlife, plus it's the centerpiece of about a 200-mile a square mile ecosystem, so that if you take that out and develop it into some kind of parking lot with a train track running around it and a major deep water port, you have really taken the heart out of a major ecosystem here in the Northwest. On the other hand, what friends of West Hayden Island believe is that this would be a perfect area to preserve for posterity, as well as to create some portion of it as a nature park, to have public accessibility to it, as well as provide some limited recreation for non-motorized boating recreationists. So it has an economic value of its own that is significantly different from one that would be industrialized. We've are aware of studies done primarily by the Trust for Public Lands that shows that these kinds of areas, when protected, become a magnet for people from all over the country to come and visit and enjoy these kinds of wildlife areas. They stay in motels, they eat at restaurants, they buy things in stores, and the overall economic impact in the region is significant. What you see on the screen right now is likely to be what West Hayden Island will look like if the port is able to convince the city to annex this into the city and rezone it from its current farm forest designation to industrial. It will be a parking lot for import cars, as well as a grain terminal and a large circumferential railroad track. So what you see now is what West Hayden Island is likely to look like probably 5 to 10 years from now.
It looks like the Columbia River as you're traveling Highway 30 and you look over to your right across the river.
Exactly.
And that's what it looks like. We already have enough of that.
This is actually T6, and so it's right across the way from West Hayden Island. This is West Hayden Island, but unfortunately the picture is sort of cut off.
Most on the right there on the bottom is West Hayden.
Most of the habitat can't be seen. It's actually a huge parcel, and it's really an amazing place. And part of what makes it so amazing is nobody's aware it's even there for the most part, because
really wasn't.
Yeah, I mean, people just haven't been out there because the port's owned it. It's been fenced off with no trespassing signs, so it's not a place that people are really conscious of. But it is this incredible resource, and and you know, the bird life out there is phenomenal. There are bald eagles, there are great blue herons. You know, just amazing wildlife. Some of the most spectacular wildlife viewing that we have in the city. And then, you know, it's really critical habitat for endangered salmon that come through our city. You know, we have 4 species that are listed under the Endangered Species Act.
I was going to ask you about that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have coho, chinook, chum, and steelhead. They come through Portland, and it's a huge challenge for them because when they're young and they're migrating to the sea, they really need places to stop and forage and rest and escape from predators about every quarter mile. And they need the shallow water habitat basically to get out of the main channel and to have that opportunity. If they don't have that, they tend to either get eaten or they go right down to the estuary and they're too small to survive. So areas like Portland and Vancouver provide a real gauntlet for them. We've developed so much of the landscape. We've taken the rivers, we've hardened the banks, we've deepened the channel, we've taken out all the riparian vegetation. If you look along the Columbia or along the Willamette in Portland and Vancouver, what you see really are very hardened banks that provide nothing for salmon. And so a place like Hayden Island is really critical for their survival. and we're at risk of losing that. The other thing to be aware of at Hayden Island is the entire area is a floodplain. It was underwater in 1996. And
the whole island was?
The entire area of West Hayden Island was underwater. Yeah, there are photographs of it that show it, underwater. And
the other end wasn't?
The other end has been filled and raised. Parts of it were underwater.
Okay. Oh.
But, we know that building in floodplains is a bad idea. And we keep learning that lesson over and over and over again.
Well, was it Davenport or a town by that?
Right.
That got completely wiped out?
Mm-hmm. Well, we've had flooding on Johnson Creek. The city is now buying out homeowners along Johnson Creek that built in the floodplain so that they can stop rebuilding and move elsewhere that makes more sense. The last thing we should be doing, especially in an age of climate change, is putting marine industrial facilities in the middle of an island floodplain. When that thing floods, all that's going to be underwater, and all the contaminants, all the crap that they're going to have out there is going to go right into our river. Mm-hmm. These are places that we need to protect.
Does Port of Portland know all this stuff that you
presented
to them?
They know it chapter and verse,
but
it's the mentality, as best as we can figure out, is much like the movie Field of Dreams. If we build it, they will come. If we build this port, if we build this new port facility, then we'll attract a whole lot of business.
That's right.
There's just not the business out there to. Plus, there are other ports on the Pacific that are much more competitive than Portland is. And in 1988, the major container shippers of the world got together and said, hey, where are going to be the major ports in the future? And they decided that it would be Seattle, Tacoma, and LA, Long Beach. And from that point on, those have grown, and Oakland, Alameda, and Portland, Vancouver have not grown nearly as much. The business has gone elsewhere.
Yeah.
And the business has gone across the river to facilities in Kalama and in Vancouver. The port simply isn't competing, and they continue to stay with this mindset that West Hayden Island is an ideal place to build a major industrial development complex, and we've looked at some economic studies that show that it will never, ever pay for itself. The investment that it will take will never be recovered, and the cost line and the profitability line will never cross. It will never become profitable.
Well, you have good credentials being pro-business, but I wonder, could you tell me an example of the mammals and reptiles that you talked about? I'm really curious about
interestingly enough, I live on the east side of the island, and from time to time we see coyotes running through our neighborhoods.
That's wonderful.
And there are probably about 3,000 people that live on the island, some in boats, some in marinas, some in condos, some in individual homes, and you see a coyote running around from time to time. We see lots of eagles. We see lots of heron, probably our most popular wildlife that we see. But when you take a boat trip around West Hayden Island, you see a lot of deer. And they're active. You see adults as well as newborns, very, very active. So they are pretty protective of themselves, and they're not always easily seen, but there's a proliferation of wildlife.
How much of this wildlife is landlocked that doesn't get off to the shores?
Well, we see them swimming back and forth from time to time.
Really?
As a matter of fact,
deer and the coyote swim, and
yes, and as a matter of fact, when Ross Island, when a nesting pair of bald eagles decided to make home on Ross Island, about half the population of herons moved, saying, "Oop, there goes the neighborhood," and they headed for West Hayden Island and for Vancouver Lake. So we see a lot of movement, and it is a major flyway both north and south for migrating birds as well as east and west. And we'll see large flocks of geese going from the island over to other parts of the Portland area as well as over to Vancouver Lake.
So how will this affect the folks, the 3,000 I think you said people that live there? What do they think about this?
Well, many of them are aware of the fact that it is a wildlife refuge and that it's predominantly undeveloped. Lots of river spoils have been pumped onto parts of the island when they've dredged the Columbia to make it a 43-foot channel. Yeah. But then there are a lot of people who aren't aware. But those who are aware, every time we talk to them about the potential of the port developing at, they give us this look like, what is the port thinking? Don't they recognize the true value of this property? Now, here's a problem. The Metropolitan Services District, Metro, has in its studies of what available developable industrial land is in the Portland area, has listed West Hayden Island as a very attractive area for industrial development. But at the same time, they've said it is a very high value, and that's in quotes, those are their words, high value, has high value environmental assets as well.
Leaving it as it is.
Yeah, so they recognize that it's high value wildlife habitat, and it's also high value industrial development.
Well, there have been a series of conflicting decisions is the problem. You know, we segregate our economic development processes from our environmental processes, and that makes for conflict. And so, you know, Metro has looked at the natural resources under Goal 5, and then at the economic resources under Goal 9, statewide land use planning goals, and determined that it's both valuable economically and environmentally. And they kicked it to the city several years ago to figure out how do you deal with that conflict. And so that's really why we're at where we're at today.
Have both.
Well, you know, that's part of the challenge here is everybody wants the win-win, and that would be great if we could do that. You know, if we could have everything we want everywhere we want it. But the reality is that there's very little left on our landscape. We've developed the vast majority of it, and we know that the ecology of our landscape is failing. We know that for many reasons. Portland Harbor is a Superfund site.
There you go.
We're spending $1.4 billion dealing with Clean Water Act violations. That's the big pipe.
Right.
Well, I know in the 50s the river made National Geographic as being one of the dirtiest in the nation, and they cleaned it up.
Well, they're still cleaning up. I mean, it's still a Superfund site.
Yeah.
We have Endangered Species Act issues. You know, there's very few rivers in the country that have the kinds of problems that we have right here, and we take great pride in our environmental ethic here. This river should be a tremendous embarrassment to our community. Between Superfund, the Clean Water Act, and the Endangered Species Act, not to mention the flooding problems we've had, that really speaks to the fact that we've actually done a pretty darn poor job taking care of this river over the years. And, you know, folks are looking for this opportunity to split what's left. Again, the fact is we've already split it and split it and split it, and each time we're left with smaller and smaller pieces of intact natural area. We're down to the very last remnants. And
like
we can't split them any further.
Just like our forest issues you mentioned, the comparison.
Exactly. And so, you know, half of Hayden Island's already gone. The surrounding landscape is already parking lots like the one that was shown on the screen earlier, and now we're down to this last 800 acres, and again, we're going to split that, and unfortunately, there isn't a win-win here. We've reached the end of the road. If we're really serious about protecting and restoring our river, we need to protect and restore places like West Hayden Island. We can't cut them in half or 2/3 again and hope that they're still going to function. The system isn't functioning now.
There is an excellent example of what we hope West Hayden Island could be. Back in 1977, when I was living in Beaverton, just on the edge of Beaverton and Aloha, there was a 200-acre wildlife refuge that the Archdiocese of Oregon owned, and a number of us said, gee, there's a confluence of two creeks into a large wetlands area, lots of wildlife here, and yet the Washington County had just rezoned it from farm forest into light industrial. So we went to a number of different government agencies to see if they would buy it. They said no, no money. So we went to the Tualatin Hills Parks and Recreation District. We were able to raise $5 million in tax money and bought this from the Archdiocese, and it is now the nature park that is managed by Tualatin Hills Parks and Recreation. It's 180 acres, right in the middle of Beaverton, Aloha, and probably the biggest user of that area are the collective school districts in the area, where they bring groups of students in to do nature study. They bring in their microscopes and their all their little chemistry sets and do analysis of this and that, and it's a great educational opportunity for the school districts. The same thing could be possible on West Hayden Island, and preserve a major chunk of it, keep a large part of it for a nature study area, and have it as recreation. It would serve Vancouver, it would serve Portland, it would maintain this as a wildlife asset instead of cutting everything down, paving it over, putting a circumferential railway track on it, and deepwater port facility, and a grain elevator. That none of which is needed, and at great expense to the local economy. We don't get it. It makes no sense. And yet, I think politically, the port is saying, oh, it's going to create a lot of family wage jobs. There are very few family wage jobs that will be created. They say, well, what about the train tracks? Aren't there going to be locomotives moving these train cars? Yes, and they will all be automated. They will be operated by a joystick by a couple of guys in a tower someplace.
They do that.
There won't be engineers on board. There may be a few people driving cars off of ships onto the parking lot, but these are $8 and $9 and $10 an hour jobs. Is that the kind of family wage job that the port is claiming will be created? Well, we don't think that the economics are there.
Well, I think regardless, I mean, a lot of these would be union jobs, and they may be well paying, but the reality is we can get those jobs to being more efficient with the existing land base. We're not saying that we don't want further development of the Port of Portland. What we believe is that can be done by making more efficient use of the land that we have in Portland and the land that's in Vancouver, having the two ports cooperate up and down the Columbia corridor. And so to the degree that business can be attracted, that's great. We're all for jobs, but let's do it smart. And in a community that prides itself on being forward-thinking and environmentally sensitive, this is a big, dumb 1950s style port project. We ought to be looking to Europe and to Asia for our models for much more effective use of the land base, not developing the last green fields that we have.
I'm not pointing the finger at anybody in particular, but the old adage, follow the money. Is there some pressure from certain groups that are wanting this to go through, that they will make money whether this thing flies or not?
Well, I think it's just the port has been the primary push behind this. We're in a bad economy right now, and so it's very hard to fight politically against anything that could potentially provide jobs, but people need to be realistic and understand that even in a best case scenario, these jobs are years and years, probably decades away if they ever come at all. And so it's not going to solve our current economic crisis, but that is certainly the way it's being portrayed, and I think politicians are very, very hesitant to jump in and do anything that can be perceived as anti-business right now, regardless of whether it makes sense or not. So I think there's a tendency to want to, again, find the win-win. And the message that we've tried to convey to the mayor and to city council is you don't have a win-win here. If you're going to develop an economically viable port facility, it's going to destroy the ecology of the island. If you're going to protect the ecology of the island, you're not going to have a port facility here. You have to look and figure out how to do it more efficiently elsewhere. A couple of arguments you're going to hear in the next couple of weeks too. One is that the only way to save it is to pave it. Sort of a classic business argument that if we don't develop it, there won't be funding available. And it's false on its face. The port and the city know darn well that Audubon and a coalition of conservation groups went to the Port of Portland in 2005 and offered to buy it. Port turned us down cold. One meeting, and they slammed the door on us. That was it. They didn't want to talk about it. So that offer's still on the table, and they're aware of that. Two, Metro tried to make it a target area for its green space bond measure, which wouldn't have required the port to sell it, but would have made money available had they wanted to sell it for protection. The port got Metro to remove it from that list. And so the port has done everything possible to destroy the mechanisms that are out there to protect this land, but we're still here and we're still willing to put together a package and purchase it from them. Beyond that, in terms of restoring the island, there's a couple of big things that are coming our way in the next couple of years. One is mitigation for the Superfund contamination that's out there. Under Superfund, they have to mitigate for the damage they did to the environment. And industry along the Willamette River is scrambling to find places that they can do that. West Hayden Island is a very, very obvious place. Two, the dams have a big problem with their impacts on fish. And under the biological opinion that they're working under now, they have to find sites to mitigate for those impacts as well. So, you know, it's another opportunity to get funding in to restore this island. So when the port claims that there's no opportunity to protect and restore this island unless they develop it and generate money, that's just flat out false. The second thing you'll hear is that it's in terrible condition, that it's just a completely degraded natural area.
That the Coyotes might want to argue about that.
I think the amazing amount of wildlife out there speaks to the fact that it's actually not in that bad of a shape. The studies that were recently produced say that it's actually, in many cases, in reasonably good shape. There's no question there's degradation. There isn't a single natural area in the metropolitan region that isn't degraded. And part of the reason this is so degraded is the port's had it for the last 20 years. They've locked it up and they haven't done a darn thing with it. But if we're going to start developing areas because they're degraded, then we ought to develop Forest Park, because we know that the majority of that is infested with invasive species. We ought to develop Oaks Bottom as well. The argument they're making would qualify every natural area in the metropolitan region for development. The fact is, it's an amazing natural resource because of its size, location, and complexity. It's in reasonably decent shape today, and it could be in much, much better shape tomorrow if the port were willing to let us do that. Superfund is a long process. It's a long way from being over.
Very expensive.
And the federal agencies, there are trustees that will look at different mitigation opportunities. West Hayden Island is in their area that they'll use for mitigation for Superfund, but it's a long process. It's a very legalistic process, and so, you know, it's not a foregone conclusion that they would accept necessarily the island itself. They might. What we would like to see really is it's used as a mitigation bank. Even if the port retained it, potentially, it could serve as a place where industry, the port, the city could do some of their mitigation for the damage it's done. So it has real economic potential to serve that purpose. A lot of the mitigation is going to be done in the North Reach itself, and it should be, because that's where the contamination actually occurred. You know, one thing I want to get out there is this goes to council on the 29th at 6 p.m. There's going to be a hearing.
I'm just going to get to that, what people can do.
to talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things that folks can do is, one, write to City Council. And if they go to our website or our Facebook page is just go to Facebook and save West Hayden Island. There's instructions. But write City Council and let them know that you're concerned about this and you want to protect it in its entirety. Two, show up at the hearing on the 29th at 6 p.m. and let Council know what you think in person.
6 p.m.?
6 p.m. Tell them that you want them to save West Hayden Island in its entirety. They need to hear that, because what we understand right now is that the port and the city are meeting. They're looking to find some sort of win-win that doesn't exist, and we're very, very concerned that the city and the port are going to roll out some sort of agreement on the 29th that essentially cuts the island in half and says that we can have it both ways. We can protect the environment and develop this. As we've already talked about, it's not necessary. There are alternatives, and this site is irreplaceable.
We believe that the City Council is tuned in to the public. All they've been hearing right now is what the port wants them to know, and what some of their own city bureau advisors have given them information on. But they really are open to hearing from the public, and we're encouraging the public to let the council know what the public really wants on West Hayden Island. Some may want economic development. Let them speak to council about that. We believe that most people who are well informed about the alternatives are going to say, keep this a wildlife area. with very limited park and recreation development. This is a gem that we can't afford to lose.
Has there been much media coverage, you know, the Willamette Week or
none.
Tribune, any of this?
None.
Really?
It's been unfortunate. You know, the media has really, I really appreciate your having us on your show, because the media in general has really tuned out from these more complex issues.
That's what Access is about.
And they tend to cover it, unfortunately, after the fact. River Plan that just moved through council was a multi-year process, very, very important in terms of recreation, the environment, and the economy, and almost none of our local papers covered it until it was right before council. And then they tended to cover it in the editorial pages. It was basically opinion rather than research, and a lot of the facts were distorted. I think the same thing's going to happen with Hayden Island, which is that you're going to get a lot of opinion, but not a lot of substance that actually looks at the facts. And it's easy to, you know, suggest that this is anti-economy or whatever, but when you look at the facts and realize there are other alternatives, you know, the facts speak for themselves.
Mm-hmm. This is what the area can expect if it's industrialized. They will get much more locomotive noise from this circumferential track. They'll get much more truck traffic because stuff's going to be moving off and on West Hayden Island. They will get much more water pollution than we have now. They'll get more diesel exhaust. They'll get more highway delays on I-5. They'll get more grain dust, which is pretty detrimental to fish and other wildlife, and they will get a greater decline in property values on Hayden Island as well as in the contiguous neighborhoods. You can expect all of these things to happen if there's industrial development there.
Because that's what happens everywhere else. I mean, we've got a really good track record on the various forms of pollution that industry brings.
Exactly.
And like you were, like, I forget who said it, but all along, you know, we've mined and poured poured it into creeks and poisoned the creeks, you know, and we've cut down the trees and caused a lot of damage. And now we're finally realizing that, you know, we've reached the western shores, and there is an end to it. And we're still conducting ourselves as if we're still moving, and we're not reached the Pacific Ocean yet, and you know, in a manner of speaking. And it's time to start taking care and doing things right, like you've been saying a couple times now. And that seems to be the most logical. But I don't know if politics is ever logical.
Well, we hope that the politicians will become much better educated by the people that they govern in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, and if you go to the Save West Hayden Island Facebook page, that'll be updated pretty much daily from here till the hearing, and you know, we'll keep folks informed. And you know, there's a reason why PGE wasn't able to develop this, and the port has been so unsuccessful for so long. It doesn't make sense. And when folks have looked at the facts, they've realized that this is a city that does pride itself on being progressive on the environment, and this is a big opportunity. We've learned to do the small things well. This is a big thing, though, and this is really, you know, no pun intended, a watershed moment for us in the sense that are we going to use the same models we've used all along that have destroyed our river? And really they have. I mean, the Superfund listing, the Endangered Species Act listing, the Clean Water Act problems speak to how badly we failed. Or are we going to do things differently and develop a 21st century model for protecting our river and promoting our economy?
We'll be hearing a whole lot more about that over the next 6 months. This is just the beginning of a major conflict that's now out in the open.
Maybe you can get it into the editorial section of the paper.
You never know.
Well, the Oregonian and the Tribune now are both thinking about doing stories, and that's a positive side.
Okay.
I'd rather get it out of the editorial section and into the news pages, because that's where I think the local media has really failed us recently. They really need to talk about the facts. They need to look at the data. There's a lot of data out there, and give the public a really good idea about what they have to gain and lose.
Okay.
We believe that if the public is well informed about the facts, they'll come up with the solution that is in their best interest, and that's really what we want.
Right.
We're not sure that the politicians would do that. We think that the public will.
Well, you know, like they say, if the people lead, the leaders will follow. So,
we hope so.
All right.